Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 81 in the book of Genesis. Now, yesterday we had an important lesson about covenants and revelation from God. So God cuts a covenant. When God cuts a covenant, he ends up having to cut it with himself. So remember, a covenant is a promise that you pledge with yourself, with your bodily integrity, with bodily harm. And God made a covenant with Abraham and therefore by us. And if we mess up, God is the one that ends up paying our deserved harm. So the penalty eventually falls on Jesus. So in chapter 15, Abram makes a covenant and God makes a covenant. And obviously this is serious business, just like if you make a covenant in marriage. And it's a very high cost covenant. So right from the get-go, God knows that he will succeed. That's the good news. Right from the get-go, God also knows that we will fail. People fail in their covenant making. And he also knows that he makes a provision for this failure right away. It's going to be down the road that it's going to be manifest. And that is, it's going to involve the personal harm of God himself, the sacrifice of his son. So this is the highest God takes the cut to be in relationship with us. So I think the lesson, kind of the heart lesson, was how valued we should be, that we're seen in this way. And when God cuts a covenant, he eventually ends up cutting himself. And this covenant is this incredible promise that God makes and makes sure that it goes through at the ultimate cost to himself. So today we're going to take that covenant and we're going to see how it manifests in a human family, that is with Sarai and Abraham. And at the end of today, I think we're going to find that Abram sins and Sarai sins. And we're going to have to rely on the covenant that we just learned about. So this is chapter 16 in the book of Genesis. Please open it. This is 16 verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, that it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abraham lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. So the first question you may want to remember is, why does this family have an Egyptian servant? Well, this came from the last time that they sinned, which was, they had to go to Egypt, 100 miles away, because there was a famine, and then there's this wonderful river called the Nile, and so they went there to get food. And when they arrived at the door, Abram says to Sarai, "Tell him you're my sister," not to protect her virtue, but to save his own life. So on the kind of this heels of the misinterpretation of the promise that he was going to have many generations, it was like Abram was saying, "Hey, God's promised me a great heritage, so I must take control of this." So it's a control issue, an impatient issue for an heir. And then Pharaoh responds. When the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female servants. That's where Haggai, female donkeys and camels. So this is Pharaoh's servant. This was Sarai's idea, just like eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was Eve's idea. And Abram acquiesces to the idea, just like Adam acquiesced to the idea. Both of them, all four of the people are sinning, so nobody's free here. So it's this present, verbal, and considered role. And Abram listens to the voice of Sarai. So bad idea number one is to usurp the sovereignty of God and try to drive the bus, not submit to him, and not to entrust in the very, very hard stuff. So that's where we're going to land on this today. So Abraham's submission to God is flawed and sinful and usurping, and Sarai's submission to God is flawed, sinful, and usurping. But the good news is this is not the end of the story for Abraham or Sarai. Both of these guys are going to be spiritual all-stars, but today is not that day. So the conception of Ismael is not done in the trust of God, either by Abram or Sarai. And the good news is that this middle of the story of their lives is not going to be the end of the story of their lives. So imagine you're Abram or Sarai, and you say, hey, I've made some mistakes and God could never use me, and boom, end of story. That's not what they did. They eventually turned faithful. But ultimately, it kind of points to, who's the faithful one in the story? It's God that's the faithful one. It's God that's the covenant maker and the covenant keeper. And yes, this is a covenant that people make and people fail. That's the bad news. But this covenant is a promise that you pledge with yourself, and somebody has to die because somebody broke the covenant. The good news is when God made the covenant with Abraham and you, he knew that he was going to have to cut himself. He knew that somebody would fail, someone had to die, and someone had to give a life. All right, so let's drill this home with some applications. So you have something hard in your life, just like Abraham and Sarai did with the infertility. And whatever that topic is, entrust it to the Lord. Entrust, especially because it's hard. If your job is to lead well. If your job is to follow well. If your job is to submit, remember everybody submits to somebody, then submit well. The happy news, I think, for all of us is if we find ourselves in the middle of the story, that is the sinful part of the story, know that it doesn't have to be the end of the story. So all spiritual all-stars were not spiritual all-stars when it started. They were sinful. They failed. They needed God. And the common thread of all all-stars is their need of God. So the good news is when God made this covenant with Abram and you, he knew that he was going to have to cut himself. He knew that somebody was going to fail. Somebody had to die, and somebody had to give a life. So let's today be entrusting and submitting. Let it be an all-star day for ourselves. It will be hard. And don't let this day be the failure day of the story. Go be an all-star. Thanks for listening.